August 24, 1985, and the Indiana State Fair in Indianapolis was celebrating its final weekend with record-breaking attendance, over 70,000 people crowding the fairgrounds to enjoy rides, exhibits, concerts, and agricultural displays. The fairgrounds sprawled across 250 acres with multiple entrances, dozens of buildings, midway attractions, and enough space that families could easily become separated in the massive crowds moving between venues. Olivia Monroe was 6 years old that Saturday afternoon, a girl with distinctive curly dark brown hair that reached past her shoulders, warm hazel eyes, and a small birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her left cheek. She wore lime green corduroy pants with cargo pockets, a yellow long-sleeved shirt with a rainbow across the front, purple high-top sneakers, and she carried a small canvas backpack shaped like a ladybug containing her water bottle. Olivia had come to the fair with her father, Thomas Monroe, a high school history teacher who was divorced from Olivia's mother and had custody of his daughter every other weekend. Thomas had planned a full day at the fair, and they'd been there since 10 a.m., enjoying rides and exhibits, and at 2:15 p.m., they were walking through the agriculture building looking at prize-winning vegetables and livestock displays. The agriculture building was enormous, roughly the size of an airplane hangar, with rows of display booths separated by wide aisles where hundreds of people wandered examining exhibits of giant pumpkins, award-winning cattle, and handmade crafts. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Thomas and Olivia stopped at a display of quilts created by 4-H members, and Thomas was reading the descriptions while Olivia stood beside him, looking at the colorful fabric patterns. A woman next to them asked Thomas a question about where to find the dairy cattle exhibits, and Thomas turned to answer her and point toward the far end of the building, a conversation that lasted maybe 20 to 30 seconds. When Thomas turned back to continue examining the quilts with Olivia, his daughter was no longer standing beside him, and the space where she'd been was empty except for other fairgoers moving through the aisles. Thomas's first reaction was mild annoyance rather than panic, thinking Olivia had wandered to look at a nearby exhibit without telling him, and he called her name while checking the immediate area around the quilt display. But Olivia didn't respond, and Thomas began walking quickly through the nearby aisles, checking both sides of the display rows, calling her name more urgently and asking other visitors if they'd seen a 6-year-old girl in green pants and a yellow rainbow shirt. Within 2 minutes, Thomas was genuinely frightened and asking agriculture building staff for help, and within 5 minutes, building security was making announcements over the PA system asking Olivia Monroe to come to the information desk. By 2:40 p.m., fair security had been alerted that a child was missing from the agriculture building, and guards were posted at all exits while a search of the massive structure began. In approximately 20 to 30 seconds, while her father answered another visitor's question 5 feet away, 6-year-old Olivia Monroe vanished from the Indiana State Fair without anyone seeing where she went. If you want to hear how this little girl was finally found 4 decades later in shocking circumstances, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's continue. Indiana State Police arrived at 3 p.m., and Detective Michael Chen immediately coordinated a lockdown of the fairgrounds, with all exits monitored, and systematic searches of every building and attraction. The agriculture building was examined thoroughly with K-9 units checking every corner, behind every display, and in storage areas, but there was no sign of Olivia anywhere in the massive structure. Bloodhounds were given Olivia's scent from her jacket in Thomas's car, and the dogs tracked from the quilt display toward one of the agriculture building's side exits, then outside toward a service road used by vendors and fair staff. The scent trail ended at the service road approximately 200 yards from the building, suggesting Olivia had been placed in a vehicle at that location and driven away from the fairgrounds. Thomas was interviewed extensively about the exact timeline and whether anyone had been paying unusual attention to Olivia during the day, but he insisted he'd noticed nothing concerning until she'd vanished. The woman who'd asked Thomas for directions was never identified despite investigators searching for her, and this raised suspicions that the question might have been a deliberate distraction to create an opportunity for someone to take Olivia. FBI was contacted by 5:00 p.m., given the potential for kidnapping and interstate trafficking, and Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from the Cincinnati field office with resources and experience from similar cases. Olivia's distinctive curly hair, hazel eyes, and crescent moon birthmark became key identifying features, and her unusual outfit of lime green pants and yellow rainbow shirt was mentioned repeatedly in media coverage, hoping someone would recognize her. By Sunday morning, the case had become national news with Olivia's photo appearing on television across the country, her curly hair and distinctive birthmark making her a recognizable image that millions of Americans saw. The lime green corduroy pants and yellow rainbow shirt became iconic elements of the case, and for years afterward people reported seeing children in similar clothing, though none of these sightings led to finding Olivia. Detective Chen focused investigation on the service road where the bloodhounds had lost Olivia's scent, and he interviewed fair workers and vendors about who had access to that area during the afternoon. The service road was supposed to be restricted to authorized vehicles, but investigation revealed that security was lax, and anyone who looked like they belonged could drive through without being challenged or documented. Surveillance cameras at the fairgrounds were limited in 1985, and the few cameras that existed were positioned at main gates rather than covering service areas or building interiors where Olivia had disappeared. Agent Wells interviewed Thomas extensively about his custody arrangement and relationship with Olivia's mother, looking for any possibility that this was a custody dispute disguised as an abduction. But Olivia's mother, Claire, was verified to have been at work in Chicago during the time of the disappearance, and she had no motive to orchestrate a kidnapping when she already had joint custody and regular visitation. The theory emerged that someone had been watching Olivia during the day, possibly following Thomas and his daughter through the fair, and had waited for an opportunity when the child was momentarily unattended. The agriculture building's size and crowds created perfect conditions for such a crime, with multiple exits and enough chaos that someone could grab a child and leave quickly without attracting attention. One witness reported seeing a woman in her 40s or 50s walking quickly through the agriculture building around 2:35 p.m., holding the hand of a small child, but couldn't provide detailed descriptions beyond that general observation. Another fairgoer mentioned noticing a white panel van parked on the service road around 2:45 p.m., with its engine running, but hadn't thought anything was suspicious at the time and couldn't recall any identifying details. These vague leads were investigated extensively, but without specific descriptions or license plate numbers, investigators struggled to identify the woman or vehicle that might have been involved. By September, the intensive daily search operations had been scaled back after 2 weeks produced no trace of Olivia, despite thousands of volunteer hours and extensive professional investigation. Thomas quit his teaching job and devoted himself to searching for Olivia, distributing flyers across Indiana and neighboring states, and he appeared regularly on television pleading for his daughter's return. Claire joined the search efforts, and despite their divorce, both parents united in their desperate attempt to find Olivia, putting aside past conflicts to focus on bringing their daughter home. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted in early 1986, and the broadcast generated thousands of tips. But each lead was investigated and found to be mistaken identity or well-meaning but inaccurate information. One particularly compelling tip came from a woman in Kentucky who reported that her neighbor had suddenly acquired a young daughter in September 1985, claiming she'd adopted the child through private channels. The neighbor was identified as Margaret Ellis, a 60-year-old widow who lived alone, and she'd introduced the girl she was calling Sarah to neighbors in late September 1985. FBI agents investigated Ellis and interviewed Sarah, but the child was approximately 8 years old, not 6, and had documentation showing she'd been legally adopted from foster care in Kentucky, eliminating her as a possibility. By 1990, the case had gone cold with periodic reviews but no active investigation, and Olivia Monroe became one of thousands of children who'd vanished in the 1980s, despite extensive searches. Age progression photos were created showing what Olivia might look like at 10, 15, 25, 35, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases as years passed without answers. Thomas never remarried and struggled with alcoholism and depression, eventually dying in 2010 at age 58 from liver failure, having spent 25 years searching for Olivia without ever knowing what happened to her. Claire survived another decade but never recovered emotionally from losing Olivia, and she maintained her daughter's bedroom exactly as it had been, unable to accept that her child was gone. The lime green pants and yellow rainbow shirt that Olivia had worn became symbols of the case, and occasionally people would report finding similar clothing at thrift stores or garage sales, generating brief hope before DNA testing or other evidence eliminated connections. The years accumulated slowly, with 1985 becoming 2000 and then 2010, and Olivia Monroe's disappearance became part of Indiana folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers of crowded public events and how quickly children could vanish. Detective James Morrison took over the cold case in 2015, and he was struck by how little concrete evidence existed beyond witness descriptions of a possible woman in white van, leads that had never been successfully pursued. Morrison used modern databases and genealogical DNA techniques to search for connections, hoping that advances in technology might reveal something investigators in 1985 had missed or been unable to pursue. He uploaded Olivia's genetic profile, created from DNA samples Claire had provided years earlier, to genealogical databases hoping distant relatives or unexpected matches might emerge. By 2020, Olivia would have been 41 years old, possibly with a career and family if she'd somehow survived, though statistical reality suggested she'd likely died shortly after the abduction. Claire Monroe died in 2021 at age 68 from cancer, and she died without ever knowing what had happened to her daughter, though she'd spent 36 years searching and advocating for missing children. Her obituary mentioned that she was survived by her missing daughter Olivia, whose disappearance had defined Claire's life and motivated her decades of activism for child safety legislation. True crime podcasts rediscovered Olivia's case in the early 2020s, and several shows featured detailed episodes about the State Fair abduction and the mysterious circumstances of her disappearance. In March 2025, a woman named Sarah Brennan living in Oregon contacted a genealogist after taking a DNA test for ancestry research and discovering unexpected results that didn't match the family history she'd been told. Sarah, age 45 and working as a librarian in Portland, had been raised by her grandmother Margaret Brennan, who died in 2019, and she'd always believed her mother had abandoned her as a baby. "My grandmother told me my mother was young and couldn't care for me, so she took me in and raised me," Sarah explained to genealogist Maria Santos. "But I never met my mother or had any documentation, and it always felt like something was missing." The DNA test results showed that Sarah had close genetic matches to people with the surname Monroe in Indiana, and further investigation revealed she was a biological match to Claire Monroe, who died in 2021. Maria immediately contacted Indiana State Police, and Detective Sarah Chen from the Cold Case Unit began comparing Sarah Brennan's DNA against Olivia Monroe's profile that had been in databases for decades. The DNA analysis took 8 weeks, and when results came back in May 2025, they showed a 99.97% probability that Sarah Brennan was biologically Olivia Monroe, the child who disappeared from the Indiana State Fair 40 years earlier. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the cold case community and made international headlines. Olivia Monroe had been found alive at age 45, living in Oregon under the name Sarah Brennan. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Margaret Brennan, who was actually Margaret Ellis from the 1986 Kentucky tip that had been dismissed, had indeed taken Olivia from the Indiana State Fair. The original investigation had cleared Ellis because the child she'd called Sarah had appeared to be 8 years old with documentation from Kentucky foster care, but investigators now realized the documents had been fraudulent. Ellis had actually been in her late 50s in 1985, not 60 as she'd claimed to Kentucky authorities, and the adoption paperwork had been sophisticated forgeries that had passed initial scrutiny. Chen theorized that Ellis had been at the Indiana State Fair specifically looking for an opportunity to take a child, and when she'd seen Thomas distracted by the woman asking for directions, she'd grabbed Olivia and quickly led her away. The woman asking for directions was likely Ellis herself or an accomplice, creating the deliberate distraction that allowed the abduction to occur while Thomas's attention was diverted. Ellis had driven Olivia to Kentucky via the service road and back routes, avoiding major highways where Amber Alerts would have been active, and she'd immediately begun the process of convincing the 6-year-old that she was her grandmother. Over the following months, Ellis had moved to Oregon, far from Indiana and Kentucky, and had raised Olivia as Sarah Brennan, telling neighbors she'd adopted her granddaughter whose mother had abandoned her. Sarah had fragmented memories of life before Ellis, but she'd been told these were dreams or imagination from when she'd been very young, and as a child she'd accepted the explanations. "I always felt like something was wrong," Sarah told investigators. "I had these vague memories of a man who wasn't my grandfather, of a different place, but Margaret said I was remembering things incorrectly from when I was a baby." Sarah Brennan's world shattered in May 2025, when Detective Chen called to inform her that she was Olivia Monroe, a child who'd been abducted from the Indiana State Fair 40 years earlier, and whose parents had searched for her until their deaths. "I'm 45 years old," Sarah said through tears. "I've lived my entire conscious life as Sarah Brennan, and now you're telling me I'm someone else entirely, that I was stolen from my father while he was standing 5 feet away." The revelation was devastating on multiple levels. Sarah had to accept that Margaret Ellis, the grandmother who'd raised her with apparent love, had been her kidnapper, and that her entire identity was built on a crime. Detective Chen handled the situation with extraordinary sensitivity, connecting Sarah with therapists who specialized in recovered missing persons, and the complex trauma of discovering your childhood was based on an abduction. Sarah was shown photos and videos of herself as Olivia at the Indiana State Fair earlier on the day she was taken, seeing the lime green pants and yellow rainbow shirt, and the crescent moon birthmark on her cheek that she'd always had. "I see myself in these photos," Sarah said. "That's my birthmark, that's my hair, but I don't remember being that little girl. I don't remember the man who was my father. And that's almost worse than if I remembered everything." The investigation revealed that Margaret Ellis had suffered multiple miscarriages in her 30s and had never been able to have children, a tragedy that had apparently led to increasing mental instability as she aged. Former neighbors from Indiana who'd known Ellis in the early 1980s were tracked down, and several recalled that she'd become obsessed with children, volunteering at schools and parks and talking constantly about wanting to be a grandmother. One neighbor remembered Ellis mentioning in summer 1985 that she was planning to attend the Indiana State Fair, which was unusual because she typically avoided large crowds, and this detail aligned with Chen's theory that she'd gone specifically to find a child. Ellis's bank records from 1985 showed she'd withdrawn a large sum of cash in August, likely to avoid creating a paper trail for the trip to Indianapolis and the subsequent move to Oregon. The white panel van that a witness had reported seeing on the service road was traced through old DMV records to Margaret Ellis, who'd owned a 1982 Dodge van that matched the general description. The van had been sold in 1987 to a buyer in California, and tracking it through subsequent owners led to a junkyard where it had been scrapped in 1995, eliminating any possibility of forensic analysis. Sarah struggled with complex feelings about Ellis, unable to completely hate the woman who'd raised her even knowing she'd been kidnapped, because Ellis had provided stability and education and what seemed like genuine affection. "She made sure I did well in school. She attended every event. She was there for me through everything," Sarah explained. "But she also stole me from my real father and kept me from knowing my mother, and I don't know how to reconcile those two realities." The ladybug backpack Olivia had been carrying was never found, likely disposed of by Ellis along with the distinctive lime green pants and yellow rainbow shirt that would have identified the child. Sarah learned that her biological father Thomas had died in 2010, having spent 25 years searching for her, and this knowledge brought overwhelming grief for the relationship they'd never had. "He died thinking I was gone," Sarah sobbed. "He spent his whole life looking for me, and he died without knowing I was alive in Oregon the entire time, and I'll never get to tell him I'm okay or that it wasn't his fault." Sarah's biological mother, Claire, had died in 2021, just 4 years before Sarah was identified, and she'd also spent decades searching and advocating for missing children without knowing her daughter was alive. Detective Chen showed Sarah the room Claire had maintained exactly as Olivia had left it, preserved for 40 years, and Sarah was overwhelmed by the tangible evidence of a mother's love that had never stopped. Sarah had built a life as an adult with a husband and teenage daughter, who were shocked to learn about her true identity, and they supported her through the process of integrating Olivia Monroe into who she was as Sarah Brennan. The case brought renewed attention to how easily children could be taken from public places, and how sophisticated abductors could create false identities that passed scrutiny for decades. Indiana authorities officially closed Olivia Monroe's case as solved in June 2025, and the story made international headlines as a rare example of a long-term missing child found alive 4 decades later. Sarah chose to legally become Sarah Olivia Brennan Monroe in July 2025, embracing both identities and honoring the 40 years she'd lived as Sarah while reclaiming the name and heritage stolen from her as Olivia. She traveled to Indiana in August 2025, exactly 40 years after her abduction, to visit the places connected to her early childhood and to stand at the Indiana State Fair, where her life had been irrevocably changed. The agriculture building where she'd been taken still stood, though it had been renovated multiple times, and Sarah walked through it trying to trigger memories that remained frustratingly just out of reach. "I don't remember being here," Sarah told reporters who'd gathered, "but standing in this building knowing this is where I was stolen from my father, it feels significant even if I can't access the actual memories." Indiana installed a memorial at the fairgrounds with Sarah's photo from both 1985 as Olivia and 2025 as Sarah, along with text explaining the case and emphasizing the importance of vigilance at public events. The memorial reads, "Olivia Monroe, taken 1985, found alive 2025, a testament to hope and the power of DNA technology, transforming the site of tragedy into a symbol of resolution." Sarah met extended family members she'd never known, cousins and aunts and uncles who remembered the little girl with curly hair and the crescent moon birthmark who'd disappeared from the fair. They shared stories about Thomas and Claire, helping Sarah understand the parents she'd lost, and they showed her photos and videos documenting the years of searching and advocacy that had defined both parents' lives. "Your father never gave up," one aunt told Sarah. "Even when everyone else said you were probably dead, Thomas kept searching, and your mother dedicated her life to helping other families of missing children, and they both died believing you were gone." Sarah visited her parents' graves and stood between their headstones crying, talking to them as if they could hear, telling them she was alive and safe and sorry they'd never known. The case inspired legislative changes in Indiana and other states, with new requirements for surveillance cameras at large public events and better protocols for immediate response when children go missing. Olivia's law was passed in Indiana in 2026, mandating that all public events with attendance over 5,000 people must have comprehensive security measures including facial recognition technology and instant alert systems. Sarah established a foundation supporting adults who discover they were abducted as children, providing resources for DNA testing, therapy, legal assistance in reclaiming identities, and help navigating complex family reunions. Within its first year, the foundation facilitated 6 identifications of long-term missing persons, proving that DNA databases were revealing cases of children taken decades earlier and raised under false identities. Sarah wrote a memoir about discovering her true identity at age 45 and the process of integrating Olivia Monroe into the life she'd built as Sarah Brennan, and the book became a bestseller. Her story inspired other adults with questionable origin stories or gaps in their early childhood documentation to submit DNA for testing, and several additional cases were solved as a direct result. The lime green corduroy pants and yellow rainbow shirt that Olivia had worn became iconic symbols of the case, and replicas were created for the memorial display at the Indiana State Historical Society. Sarah's teenage daughter struggled initially with learning her mother's true identity, but eventually found it fascinating and began advocating for missing children herself, inspired by the grandmother she'd never met. Sarah's husband supported her journey, though he admitted the situation was surreal, learning that the woman he'd married had an entire hidden childhood and family history that even she hadn't known about. The case proved that DNA technology combined with genealogical databases was revolutionizing cold case investigations, and that adults should investigate their backgrounds if anything about their early years seemed unclear. It demonstrated that children abducted young enough may have no clear memories of their original families, making them vulnerable to being raised under false identities for decades without realizing they were stolen. And it showed that even when both parents die without knowing the truth, finding missing children still matters for the siblings, extended family, and the missing person themselves, who deserves to know their real identity. Sarah continues her foundation work while maintaining her librarian career in Oregon, and she travels to Indiana quarterly to visit her parents' graves and connect with extended family. She keeps age progression photos that had been created over the decades, showing what Olivia might look like at various ages, and she's struck by how accurate some of them were in predicting her adult appearance. The crescent moon birthmark on her cheek, which had been such a distinctive identifying feature in 1985, became a symbol of her journey, and she now views it as a permanent connection to Olivia Monroe. "I'm both people," Sarah told a documentary filmmaker. "I'm Sarah Brennan, who built a life and career and family in Oregon, and I'm Olivia Monroe, who was stolen from her father at a state fair, and both identities are real and valid." The case stands as one of the most remarkable missing persons resolutions in American history. A child taken at age 6 and found alive at age 45 through DNA technology and genealogical research. It reminds us that 6-year-olds should be safe at state fairs with their parents, that 20 seconds of distraction is all an abductor needs, and that families deserve truth even when it comes 4 decades late. And in Indianapolis, where a little girl in lime green pants once stood looking at quilts with her father before vanishing, her story lives on as proof that DNA can solve the impossible and bring stolen children home, even after 40 years. Sarah Olivia Brennan Monroe lives in Portland with her family, maintaining connections to both her Oregon life and her Indiana heritage, living proof that even the coldest cases can be solved with persistence and technology. The agriculture building at the Indiana State Fair now has enhanced security and surveillance, and staff are trained on Olivia's case as an example of how quickly children can be taken and why vigilance matters.